What was the gut feeling that you listened to that saved your life? Story 1. Driving uphill behind a flatbed truck carrying I-beams, and I envisioned them sliding off the truck and hitting my windshield. I changed lanes so I wasn't behind the truck, and 2 seconds later, the I-beams were sliding off onto the road where my car would have been, sparking and gouging the pavement. Terrifying. To this day, I won't stay behind a truck with anything that's strapped down. Story 2. I was 18, freshly out of high school, and got a job at a newly opened pizza place. The crew was all younger kids around my age. I quickly befriended another girl working there, but there was a guy, maybe a year or two older than me, who just gave me the weirdest vibes. I just felt uncomfortable being around him. He didn't really do anything outright strange. He hit on me and kept asking for my number. But I had a boyfriend, now my husband, and kept turning this guy down. He was never rude or about it or anything, so I had no real reason to feel anything was off about him, but I did. Sometimes while I was working, I'd feel like someone was staring at me, and I'd turn around and he'd be watching me from the other side of the kitchen. I remember telling the girl I had befriended that I just felt something was off about that guy, and he made my skin crawl. Another coworker, who had gone to school with the guy, overheard the conversation and told me that he understood his friend could be intense and off-putting, but he was mostly harmless. The other girl and I just kind of tried to laugh it off, but she agreed that something just didn't feel right. I always worked the late shift, so I could start after my college classes, and I worked until close. One night, the creepy guy got off work maybe an hour or two before close, and I was scheduled to close, so he leaves at his scheduled time, and I work until close, and then go to leave, and walk to my car. It was around 1 a.m. at this time, and super dark. As I'm walking to my car, I noticed someone else in the parking lot. It was the creepy guy, and he was just standing there, watching me. His car was still there, so he wasn't waiting for a ride. He had just waited for me to leave. I got in my car and felt just incredibly weirded out by the entire thing, so I left, went home to my apartment, told my partner what happened, and then sent my manager a text and said I was sorry, but the creepy guy was making me uncomfortable to the point that I couldn't work there anymore, and that had been my last night. I never went back. About a month later, I see on the news that the creepy guy from the pizza place had followed the other girl from work, the one I had been friends with, one night after a closing shift. He had waited outside her house in the dark, broke in when everyone was asleep, murdered her dad, and held her hostage, assaulted her for hours, while the police and SWAT team tried to get him out of the house. I still think about her a lot, and at the time, I felt genuinely guilty about what happened to her, as if I could have done something to prevent it. Story 3. When I was 13, I was walking to the bus stop in the morning. A car was going through my neighborhood very slowly, which made alarm bells go off in my head. When it passed me, I glanced over my shoulder to keep an eye on it, and saw it was doing an immediate U-turn. Noped right out and dove through the bushes, crossed a bunch of driveways, and found a neighbor who was washing his car. I looked back to where I had been standing. The strange car had stopped. A seriously scary-looking dude had gotten out and was looking in the bushes. IDK if I would have died exactly, but I would not have had a good time. Story 4. Not mine, but my mother's. I was 5 and walking with my mom to visit a friend. We were going to have lunch and see her new kitten. We walked up the driveway, and my mother stopped to look at the front of the house. She noticed all the windows facing the street were closed with the curtains down. Very unusual for her friend, who enjoyed watching birds at the feeders placed throughout the yard. She quickly picked me up and began back down the driveway. I protested that I was hungry and wanted to see the kitten. My mom hushed me and carried me home. This was in the late 70s before cell phones. She called her friend several times and then called my father and asked him to check on her friend as she was worried. My mom was right to be worried. Her friend had been raped and murdered by an intruder. He was never caught. Something about those closed drapes warned my mother away from that home and may have saved us from an encounter with an evil person. Story 5. Not my life, but my son's. I was 33 weeks pregnant, and I noticed my son wasn't moving as much as usual. I waited a day, and nothing changed. Despite advice by doctors and family saying I should just stay home, and he wasn't moving as much because he was just running out of room to move, I went into the ER and had my son that night due to fetal distress. He had his umbilical cord wrapped around his neck 8 times and weighed just 3 pounds. He spent 30 days in the NICU and now is a happy 2-year-old. Story 6. My grandmother accidentally saved my mom's life by not allowing her to go to a sleepover when she was young. During the night, the father murdered his entire family and would likely have killed my mother had she been there. Story 7. In middle school, I was up late one night. Mom and brother asleep, Dad gone on business. I had let the dog out, and when I went to go get him, I got a bad feeling like someone was out there. There wasn't really a reason to feel this way. It was just dark, and I got spooked, so I put the chain lock up on the back door when we got back inside. Back then, we never locked our doors. A few minutes later, the dog is drinking by the back door, and he suddenly stops and starts growling, like a low grumble, at the door. I was sitting where I could see the dog, but not the door. Then I hear the door pull open and the chain lock catch. The dog started barking like crazy, and I ran upstairs to wake my brother up. He went out and looked around, but no one was there. I think the dog's barking scared them away, but I don't know who it was, or what would have happened if I hadn't locked the door. Story 8. Husband went to pick up takeout in the winter while it was snowy. As he was leaving, he got a feeling to stay inside the restaurant and not go to his car, so he stayed for an extra minute, and right then a van slid on the ice and hit his car on the driver's side where he would have been had he gone out. Story 9. Not saved a life, but definitely serious injury. We had a workshop in our place, and we had to book them in. So Brad, not real name, thought it'd be fun to hold a nail gun in for repair on someone's hand. We both told him off for it, but he retorted, "It's all right, I checked it's got no nails in it," and then used it on the table instead, and bang goes right through the table. Turns out, while it didn't have any nails, the firing pin had snapped inside, and that nailed into the table before being reset back into the nail gun. He never messed about with nail guns again. Story 10. I was pregnant in the very early weeks, 5-6 weeks, and started getting these intense pains on the right side of my abdomen, like so extremely painful that I woke up in the middle of the night and couldn't make noise or move. Went to my doctor the next day, and he said I was being hysterical and it's completely normal to be in pain when you're pregnant. He refused to get me to an OB/GYN and said I could go private if it was such a big deal. Went to a private scan, and my pregnancy was ectopic, stuck in my fallopian tube, and my tube had ruptured and I was bleeding internally. Was rushed to hospital and had surgery to remove my tube that night. If I hadn't booked that scan, I would have died in my sleep that night due to internal bleeding. Story 11. About 2 years ago, me and my dad loved going on night walks. It was something we've always done more or less every night. One night, however, as we're about halfway through our daily route, we got to an alleyway. Now normally, I've never thought anything of it, but something this night just told me not to walk through. I had a really bad feeling, and I urged my dad to just go back home. He kept brushing it off and saying I was just scared of the dark and nothing was going to happen. After a couple of minutes of arguing, we finally turned back and walked home. Turns out about 20 minutes after we left, there was a completely random attack in that exact alleyway that left a poor young girl stabbed, thankfully not to death, but with life-changing injuries. I still dread to think what would have happened if we didn't walk back.